네, 서울대학교 지리학과에 있는 임동근입니다. 예. 제 주제가 원래 정치지리학이었는데 한국에서는 정치지리학을 강의할 일도 별로 없고 그리고 수요도 별로 없습니다. 그 이유 중에 가장 큰 것은 아무래도 그 한국이 이제 제국의 경험이 없다 보니까 제국 입장에서 땅을 통치해서 이득을 이렇게 경험했던 역사 자체가 드물어요. 그래서 정치지리학, 뭐 지정학이라고 보통 얘기를 하기도 하고, 뭐 정치지리학이라고 하는 부분들은 항상 그 우리한테는 없는 것, 그리고 우리는 어쩔 수 없이 당하는 것, 이런 그 소극적인 자세에서 학문을 갖다가 이제 그 수용을 했던 경우가 많습니다. 그러다 보니까 이제 제 본 주제에 대해서 말할 기회가 없었는데 지금 이제 카나 씨를 모시고 이렇게 얘기를 하게 돼서 어떻게 보면 저는 오히려 학생 때로 돌아가는 듯한 느낌을 많이 받았습니다. 책을 읽으면서. 그러니까 제가 유학했을 때라든지 아니면 공부했을 때 이런 논의들이 어떻게 진행이 되는지가 이제 한참 전에 있었던 기억이기 때문에 좀 새롭게 다시 그러니까 그 생각할 수 있는 기회를 제공한 것 같고요. 그리고 그 또 두 번째로는 뭐가 있냐면 지금 워낙 세상이 이렇게 빨리 변하다 보니까 지금 이 상황은 선조들이 경험했던 그런 상황이 아니에요. 너무 빨리 변하고 그다음에 새로운 것들도 많이 나오고 언제나 새로운 해석을 갖다 요구를 하게 됩니다. 이 새로운 해석을 요구를 할 때면 이 직관이 필요한데 이 직관은 과거의 것들을 갖다 계속 생각하는 수밖에 없거든요. 그래서 점점 더 역사적인 그런 고찰들이 훨씬 더 많이 필요해지는 상황입니다. 지리학적인 것뿐만 아니라 역사적인 것까지. 그래서 이 책을 보면서 이제 당대에 있는 이 문제들과 그다음에 이제 역사적인 교훈들을 갖다가 어떻게 이제 같이 이렇게 융합할 것인지가 이제 중요한 이슈로 등장을 하게 될 것 같습니다. 그 공급망이라는 네트워크가 기존 국제 정치의 산물의 국경을 약화시킨다는 주장을 갖다가 하셨습니다. 그래서 이 어려운 주제이기도 합니다. 지리학에서는 크게 네트워크냐 아니면 테리토리얼리티냐 영토성이냐의 두 개의 논쟁이 한 10년 전부터 있었습니다. 그래서 네트워크가 중요하다 아니면 주권 국가가 중요하다 영토가 중요하다라는 두 논쟁이 있었는데 카나 씨의 주장은 이제 네트워크로 세상을 바라보자라는 부분입니다. 토폴로지컬한 그런 그 릴레이션십이 훨씬 더 중요하다라고 얘기를 하시는 건데, 근데 여기서 질문입니다. 국가가 통제하는 경계를, 그러니까 보더를, 그러니까 국경을 갖다가 이렇게 관통하는 네트워크지만 이런 관통망 자체가 국가의 영토성을 강화하는 것이 아닌가라는 질문이 있습니다. 이거는 왜 그러냐면, 그러니까 국가가 한정된 자신의 영토에서 기반 시설을 갖다가 이렇게 만들고, 그걸 네트워크로 만들고 통제하면서 이제 근대 국가가 이제 발전을 합니다. 그래서 국철, 국도, 국가 항만 이런 것처럼 국가의 인프라스트럭처를 갖다가 통합하면서 근대 국가가 발전을 했는데 마찬가지로 국가 간의 연결을 하는 것들도 두 개의 국가 혹은 복수의 국가 간의 네트워크지 국가를 제거하는 네트워크가 아니다라는 게 이제 핵심 질문입니다. 그래서 중국의 예에서 보듯이 이제 국가 네트워크의 국내외 국가 간 네트워크 발전이 오히려 강한 국경 위에서 훨씬 더 쉽게 만들어지는 경우를 갖다 많이 볼 수가 있습니다. 그러니까 국가 간에 양쪽에 있는 국가 간의 힘이 클수록 국경을 넘는 인프라스트럭처의 힘이 세진다라는 거죠. 이 부분이 이제 큰 질문 중에 하나입니다. 그래서 영토성이냐 아니면은 그 네트워크냐라는 논쟁에서 이 국가를 어떻게 바라봐야 되는지.
This is a very good question. Actually, the argument in connectography is that by amassing and concentrating supply chains is how a country becomes powerful. Let's look at some examples and also talk about the relationship between supply chains and borders. If you look at the rise of America to become a superpower, it begins in the early 19th century with import substitution industrial policy. America wanted to stop importing from England and start manufacturing and producing and selling to the world. And that's how America built its trade surpluses, its currency reserves, invested in its infrastructure and its expansion. And by the early 20th century, America was by far the most powerful country in the world. The story of its power begins with supply chains. Now, of course, its territoriality became more robust. But if you look at America's trade relationships, look at America and Canada. This is actually the largest bilateral trade relationship in the whole world. They share the longest border in the world. But if you look at the economies of Vancouver or Toronto or Montreal or Chicago or Seattle, you see that these cities across the border have very intense trade relationships with each other. The strength of Canada depends on its supply chain connectivity across the border to the United States. And Canada is also a powerful country, partially because instead of insisting on the stringentness and the strictness of the border, it enhances its connectivity across the border. Would Canada be powerful if it were not for its connectivity across the border to America? Of course not. It would not be powerful at all. Now let's look at Asia. How did Asia become this superpower region? Because it used to be very poor. And after World War II, it was either destroyed or weak, or post-colonial countries that were very poor. What happened was that companies came, bringing the supply chain, bringing the technology, transferring the technology, building local capacity. So the countries had very weak sovereignty, had very weak sense of territoriality, very frail and fragile borders. The companies have the leverage. The companies hold the capital, companies hold the technology. This is the time in the 1960s and 1970s when Professor Susan Strange at the London School of Economics began to formulate the theory of triangular diplomacy. She said when multinational companies negotiate with poor countries, they have the power, and the states are weak. The states are begging to have the foreign investment from the companies. The reason that Asian states today have stronger territoriality is because they have begun to harness the foreign supply chains that foreign companies brought to them. So yes, their territoriality is now stronger, but it's because of what came from across the borders. And so you very rightly raised the example of China. China is now the latest example of a superpower that began its rise by capturing the world's supply chain. China was very poor. It was a peasant society. In 1979, Deng Xiaoping declared that Shenzhen would be China's first special economic zone. And that is where the Chinese miracle growth story began. It began with the supply chain. It began with becoming the world's factory floor. And that is the beginning of the rise of China's wealth creation and poverty alleviation, and its ability to have the large currency reserves to invest in infrastructure, and now not only to have a very secure sense of territoriality, but to use supply chains to expand outward, because Chinese companies are now exporting their surplus excess capacity of iron ore, of steel, of workers. The construction companies are pushing abroad, and so they are using the supply chain as a tool of geopolitical leverage. So there is a very ambiguous, very multi-directional relationship between supply chains, power, and territoriality. But we certainly cannot understand the geopolitics of borders in the 21st century without thinking about the infrastructure and supply chains that are crossing the borders.
예, 공급망이 21세기 들어서 갑자기 늘어나는 건 사실입니다. 증가를 많이 했거든요. 근데 그와 동시에 물리적인 벽들 또한 어마어마하게 많이 늘어났습니다. 아프리카도 마찬가지고, 그다음에 미국의 트럼프 월이라든지, 그다음에 이제 요즘 유럽에서는 제일 문제가 되는 게 이제 쉥겐 조약입니다. 쉥겐 조약은 그 조약 안에, 그러니까 조약에 가입한 국가 간에는 물자와 인구의 자유로운 흐름을 보장하는 그 조약이었는데, 그런데도 불구하고 그 안에 이제 그 물리적인 장벽이 만들어지기 시작을 했습니다. 그러면서 인구를 갖다 통제를 하는 거죠. 어떻게 보면 유럽 연합과 관련돼서는 굉장히 모순적인 그러한 그 문제가 발생을 한 건데, 이런 흐름을 갖다가 어떻게 생각을 해야 되는 건지가 이제 그 두 번째 질문입니다. 즉 한쪽으로는 국경을 넘나들려고 하는 끊임없는 그 인프라스트럭처가 확장이 있고, 한쪽으로는 인프라스트럭처뿐만이 아니라 흐름 자체를 갖다가 막아버리는 이제 벽들이 생기는 거거든요. 그러니까 가장 최근에 이제 그 만들어진 현상이기도 하고, 이 책을 쓰셨을 때는 이런 문제가 이제 별로 없었을 텐데 요즘 많이 부각되는 문제라서 한번 이거에 대해서 이제 여쭤보고 싶습니다.
The central paradox in connectography is that we actually have more borders than ever in history. There are 200 sovereign states today. At the end of World War II, there were only 51 members of the United Nations. Today, there are 200 members of the United Nations. So we have more borders technically, legally, nominally, and therefore there is more friction on paper. But in reality, not only do we have more borders than ever, but we have far more flows than ever. We have far more movement of goods, far more movement of capital, far more movement of people, far more movement of data than ever in history, every single day. So, objectively speaking, the volume of flows is far more powerful than the volume of friction. Let's talk about borders and walls. These are symbols of friction, and they're primarily focused on demographics, on controlling the movement of people. But where they are going up, they are a response to the overwhelming volume of flows that has already taken place. So, for example, the two busiest borders for crossing, the two borders with the most happening across the border in the whole world, are the United States and Canada and the United States and Mexico. 50 million crossings every year between the United States and Canada. 30 million crossings a year between the United States and Mexico. So today there actually is no Trump wall. And even if you build a Trump wall, that is intended to stop 5,000 illegal migrants, 10,000 illegal migrants. Is that a lot of people? It's almost nothing. Every day, legally, over the course of 1 year, you have 30 million legal crossings between the United States and Mexico. So even if you had a wall, it's not intended to stop the 30 million crossings. So it's interesting because these are the two busiest borders on the planet Earth, and they always will be, even if you build a wall. In Europe, you have intense migration between countries. There have been a couple of countries in Eastern Europe that have said, let's put up a fence because there are illegal crossings of refugees coming from Syria. That's a temporary measure. The fact is that Europeans are completely integrated. They have one currency, one passport, and even if you have temporary controls, even if some countries say that they want to curb the freedom of mobility under the Schengen Agreement, they haven't actually done it yet. What they're doing is saying, well, let's try to control how long foreigners can live in the country once they've already come in the country. So I don't worry about Europe. Africa has 53 countries. All of the heads of state of African countries came together last year at a summit, and they declared they want to have a visa-free continent by 2020. No restrictions, no visas, 1.2 billion people. Now let's take Southeast Asia, ASEAN, 700 million people. 2 years ago, visa-free mobility across all ASEAN countries, 700 million people. So the fact is that walls are coming down. Even where walls are going up, they don't even mean anything because you have so much more crossing. And the ultimate statistic is the fact that there are more than 1.5 billion people crossing borders every year, more than ever in history. There are 300 million people who live outside of their country of birth, 300 million people, more than ever in history. So yes, there may be a couple of physical walls that have a very specific symbolic purpose. But in the long run, all those walls are overwhelmed by the flows of people over them. And that is what history tells us about every single wall, about every single border in history. I happen to think that will eventually be the case between South Korea and the North as well.
예, 세 번째 질문 들어가겠습니다. 예, 세계가 공급망 전쟁이라고 하지만 하나의 네트워크 안에 포섭된 두 단체가, 그러니까 두 국가가 서로 다 윈윈하는 경우는 아니었거든요. 그러니까 예를 들면은 인도와 영국이었습니다. 하나의 네트워크에 연결된 국가들의 힘의 차이에 의해서 부가 한쪽으로 쏠리는 경우도 분명히 있었습니다. 역사적으로는. 국가 안에서도 마찬가지인 게 이제 대도시 발전을 하면 중소도시가 망하는 경우도 많았고요. 그래서 네트워크로 되어 있는 포섭되는 것, 네트워크로 포섭되는 것, 연결망이 확장되는 것은 어떤 사람들, 특히 힘이 없는 사람들한테, 힘이 없는 부족들한테는 멸망을 뜻하기도 했습니다. 또한 이제 그러니까 사스키아 사센처럼 네트워크가 이제 부의 순환을 가져오기도 하지만 결국 중요한 거는 이 플로우를 누가 컨트롤하는가, 이 컨트롤하는 힘은 점점 더 세계 도시에 집중하는 것이 아닌가라는 생각이 있습니다. 여기에 대해서 이제 어떻게 생각하시는지요?
This is a very good question. We have a concentration of wealth in global cities, but we have more global cities than before. By some measures, today we have about 7 or 8 truly global cities that concentrate the maximum volume or flows of goods, of services, of people, of capital, of data. Those are London and New York, then Hong Kong and Singapore and Tokyo, Shanghai, Dubai, Los Angeles. These are considered the 7 or 8 major global cities. But they have not sucked the wealth from the rest of the world because we also have dozens of other mega cities and regional gateway cities and hubs around the world that are thriving and growing. As the economic pie is growing, wealth is also growing in these other cities where you have more investment coming from the global cities. There are countries where there is a parasitic relationship, where because one city is thriving, the others are getting neglected. You can see this in a regional level. For example, Chicago is becoming much stronger, and the cities around it are getting weaker. In America, actually, Los Angeles and New York, two cities, represent almost 25% of America's GDP. But that is not a universal phenomenon. If you look at a country like Germany, you have 6 or 7 significant mid-sized cities, all of which are getting wealthier through their roles in different parts of the global value chains. Berlin, Hamburg, Stuttgart, Cologne, Frankfurt, Munich, right? All of those are wealthy cities. All of them are hubs for global supply chains or have a role in the world, media, all sorts of things. And they're all wealthy and getting wealthier. That is why Germany is such an interesting role model for the relationship between urbanization and connectivity. In China, one cannot say that the key cities, Shanghai and Beijing, have stolen the wealth. Because otherwise, how would you explain the rise of Guangzhou, of Chongqing, of Chengdu? There is tremendous growth in many, many cities in China. In fact, in most of the cities in the world with the fastest growing property prices, real estate markets are in China, in the second tier cities. So actually the global picture is very uneven. The lesson that we learn is that countries have to invest in the distribution of wealth and not allow over-concentration in one city. In Indonesia or in the Philippines, so much of the economy is centered on Jakarta or Manila. But these countries have more than 100 million people. In the case of Indonesia, more than 200 million people. If all of the economy is concentrated in one city, that's very bad for the rest of the country. It means that the government is not doing enough to distribute the wealth generated in the capital to the rest of the people in the country. But the error, the mistake, is not the fault of globalization and global networks. The blame is the government that is not redistributing the wealth adequately. And that is the responsibility of government to do that. And I think that is where the challenge is that we are at today. That too many countries have too much concentration of wealth in one city, which is a good problem, but they have to fix the problem by reinvesting their wealth in the rest of the country.
방금 말씀하신 거는 한국에서는 교훈이 굉장히 많겠는데요. 서울에 나날이 집중하고 있는 상황에서 이렇게 인프라스트럭처를 갖다가 이렇게 분배를 갖다 잘 해야 된다라는 얘기는 꼭 이제 들어야 될 거긴 한데 문제는 그게 이제 시장에 역행한다는 겁니다. 가만히 놔두면 계속 집중하게 돼 있는 거거든요. 그러면 이걸 어떻게 이제 분배를 할 것인가는 또 다른 정치의 영역인 것 같습니다. 서울 근교에 한국 인구의 반이 살거든요. 근데 돈은 90%가 있습니다. 그래서 굉장히 지금 그 서울로의 부의 집중이 굉장히 힘든 상황, 그냥 그 집중 자체가 너무 힘든 상황이라서 그래서 이제 지금 그런 식의 말씀을 드렸습니다. 네 번째 질문입니다. 부족의 논의를 하셨는데, 그러니까 그러니까 이게 분리주의가 우리나라에서는 별로 문제가 안 되지만 유럽이나 아니면 아프리카나 이런 쪽에서는 너무나 지금 심각한 문제입니다. 그래서 결국은 그 땅을 원하는 사람들한테 권한을 줘라라고 하는 권력 이양, 권한 이양에 대해서 이제 많은 부분을 갖다 이 책에서 설명을 하셨습니다. 근데 이제 여기 이제 중요한 부분이 있는 게 분할과 통합이라는 얘기입니다. 분할과 통합에서 그 정치학이죠. 정치학에서는 굉장히 중요한 말인데 통치하기 이퀄 나누기라는 얘기를 많이 합니다. 나누는 이유는 통치하기 위해서인 거고요. 즉 뭐냐면 부분으로 있는 게 이제 부분이 활성화되는 것들은 그것들을 통치할 수 있는 힘이 있을 때 나뉘어진다는 겁니다. 이건 우리의 상식이랑 조금 다릅니다. 우리는 힘이 없을 때 분리가 될 거라고 생각을 하는데 분리가 되는 이유 자체는 뭐냐면 그 분리가 됐음에도 불구하고 통치할 수 있는 권한이 뭔가 있기 때문이에요. 그건 어떻게 얘기를 상상을 해보시면 되냐면 이유가 있으니까 스코틀랜드가 분리하고 싶어하는 거고 바스크가 나가기 쉬운 거고 이런 겁니다. 그러니까 이런 문제가 있어서 결국 이제 그 governing is dividing이라는 명제가 있습니다. 근데 하지만 분할을 막는 힘 또한 지금 상존하고 있습니다. 그러니까 제일 대표적인 게 이제 중국인 거죠. 그래서 그 티벳이라든지 아니면 위구르라든지 신장 위구르라든지 이런 쪽에서는 그것들을 무력으로 억제를 하고 있습니다. 이 논의는 이제 공급망의 확대라면 어떻게 보면 모순적이거나 아니면 이렇게 무관한 것 같은데 이렇게 부족의 논의를 갖다가 그 말씀하실 때 칸나 씨께서 부족에 대해서 얘기를 하실 때 이 중국에서 벌어지는 그러니까 그 티벳을 억제한다든지 아니면 유럽에서도 몇 군데에서 벌어지는 이 분리주의, 반분리주의의 흐름들을 갖다가 어떻게 고려를 하셨는지 그런 것들을 갖다 여쭤보고 싶습니다.
This is a very good question also. Now, China is, of course, a very powerful, unitary, centralized state. So China has been suppressing localism for a long time. It has concerns about independence, secessionist movements like Tibet, like Xinjiang, for hundreds of years. It has the capacity to suppress them, and it did before its major infrastructural expansion that it is now undertaking. The infrastructure and the supply chains that pass through Tibet and pass through Xinjiang in particular to reach Central Asia, to reach Kazakhstan, to reach Uzbekistan, these have become particularly important because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because now these countries border China, and other than Kazakhstan, they don't border Russia. So China is expanding its influence in Central Asia, and to do so, its infrastructure must cross through Xinjiang and Tibet. So that is why its ability to suppress localism is stronger than ever before. Now, I have been traveling in Western China for more than 10 years. I have a lot of sympathy for the unique cultures, for their desire for more autonomy within China. But the more time that passes, the more we move forward, the more China's capacity to suppress increases, not decreases. So it's unfortunate, but there will not likely be any independence for these provinces. Remember that these are not just small provinces. These are the two largest provinces by territory in all of China. So they're not going to be given up by the most powerful state in Asia. But let's also talk about the cities, because China has allowed a very substantial amount of administrative and economic devolution. Now, the Chinese central bank, the Chinese finance ministry is still the driving engine of national infrastructure investment. And it is also reorganizing the administrative geography of cities in order to make them more efficient agglomerations and clusters. But it is also allowing each city to have more freedom to develop its own economic strategies. What will be the key technologies here? What companies can we attract? What skills must we be teaching the students? They are starting to think about these issues on their own, and they coordinate with Beijing. But there is a famous saying that the hills are high and the emperor is far away, and you see more and more that Chinese cities are developing their own dynamism. Now, they are not going to challenge the state, just like the frontier provinces will not challenge the state. But it is better for Beijing if these cities develop strong economies, because that reduces the burden on Beijing, where actually currency reserves are falling and there's a lot of financial stress because of very high debt. So being a network of cities that are all thriving and connected within a country is a good thing. And China is trying to become what I call an empire of megacities.
파생되는 질문은 많지만 나가진 않겠습니다. 예. 다섯 번째 질문입니다. 그러니까 공급망 전쟁에서 이제 상호 혜택을 말씀을 하시면서 자급을 위해 비용을 더 지불할 기업이 있는가라고 얘기를 하면서 그 자급자죠. 그러니까 갇혀 있는, 그러니까 고립되어서 훨씬 더 많은 비용을 갖다가 지불할 거면은 왜 고립할 것이냐라는 질문이었습니다. 근데 이와 동시에 이제 제조업이 소비 시장 중심으로 이동한다고도 말씀을 하셨어요. 그러니까 이건 두 개의 이제 다른 별도의 챕터에서 나오는 얘기입니다. 이 둘을 결합을 하면 여러 소비 시장에 집중된 복수의 제조업 네트워크 형태로 생산 구조가 만들어진다는 것인데, 이거는 경제 지리학에서는 굉장히 중요한 이슈 중에 하나입니다. 그러니까 대표적인 예가 나이키 공장이 미국으로 가고, 그다음에 아디다스 공장은 다시 독일로 가고, 그러니까 생산 라인만 가는 거죠. 사람은 안 가고. 그리고 가서도 새로운 고용도 없고, 이게 이제 4차 혁명으로 나오는 얘기들인데, 이제 이 현재 제조업의 흐름은 점점 더 제3세계 공장에서 멀어지는 쪽이 아닌가라는 겁니다. 왜냐하면 가장 큰 소비지는 여전히 이제 그 서구 유럽부터 시작해서 구매력이 많은 지역에 이제 집중을 하다 보니까 그런 것이 아닌가라는 질문이 하나 있고, 뭐 그럼에도 이제 그 뭐 중국이나 이런 말씀을 하실 거예요. 그쪽은 워낙 많이 뜨는 부분이니까 이제 나올 텐데, 그럴 때 이제 유럽의 역할 아니면 뭐 미국에서의 개입이 도대체 어떤 식으로 진행이 되는 건지, 애플이라든지 구글이라든지 지금 나오고 있는 트럼프의 그 정책들, 이런 것들을 갖다가 좀 뒤에 좀 추가해서 물어봐 주시면 감사하겠습니다.
It's a very good question. Today, supply chains have become so global, so distributed, though in some industries we see a very high concentration in Asia. For example, in textiles, apparel, manufacturing. But this is also the geography where the largest markets are for electronics, for apparel, for textiles, and so forth. And so Western companies, or even Asian companies, need to produce where the market is. So against this is the idea of nearshoring, the idea that if you relocate production back to the home market, like Europe or America, that you could save costs because instead of human labor, you would use robotic automation. The fact is that that's not happened. It's barely happened at all. It's a myth. It's a myth for many, many powerful reasons that people have failed to understand. Let me explain them now. The first is that the input cost of nearshoring, it has to be understood. In America, energy is a very small part of the cost, and labor a large part. But you do not have the industrial robotics replacing human labor across all of these areas such that you could save the costs that much in America. The more powerful reason is that America is not the largest market for its own goods. The rest of the world is. So if Apple decides to make every iPhone and iPad in America, how would it export them across the Pacific Ocean to Asia? That would take a long time. It would cost a lot of money. And they would face non-tariff barriers. They would face restrictions. When you make a product in China, then China is very happy to allow it to be sold. If you don't make it in China, they will make it very difficult. And then Apple's share price, Apple's stock, will go down. Now let's take Adidas. Adidas finally began to make one part of the shoe sole for one new shoe through a 3D printing facility in Germany. So the executives of Adidas were asked, does this mean you're going to shut down your factories in Asia, where 99% of your shoes are made? He said, absolutely not. We make more than 60 or 70 million pairs of shoes a year, and the maximum number that we will make from this facility are probably about 500,000, right?
Right.
So you have to be very close to your customers. In order to be close to your customers, you have to make things where your customers are, whether through humans or through robots or both. But you certainly have to be there. And the customers are in the developing world, in Asia, in South Asia, Middle East, Africa. So in the future, I expect more globalization, not less globalization. Because there is a difference between what technology will allow and what technology makes possible and what politics will allow. So even if Trump wants things to be made in America, it's not good for the American companies to make things in America. And so you can clearly see in the last 6 months, the things that he said he would do and things he wanted to do have all fallen apart because it does not make sense for the companies and it does not make sense for the national economy. So there is really a myth about nearshoring, a myth about bringing labor back, and just as there is a myth about walls and borders.
실크로드를 말씀을 하셨는데 11세기, 12세기, 13세기 그 이전부터 있었던 당시에는 가장 첨단의 인프라스트럭처를 가졌던 제국들이 아시아에는 굉장히 많습니다. 근데 문제는 이런 굉장히 중요한 그 좋은 공급망을 가진 국가와 기업들이 영속하지 않았다라는 거예요. 그래서 폐허가 된 당시에 세계 최고의 기반 시설들이 이제 그 아시아, 특히 이제 중앙아시아에 굉장히 많습니다. 결국 공급망이라고 하는 네트워크가 영토성이라는 패러다임을 바꾸는 중요한 전환이라고 생각할 수도 있지만 단지 네트워크가 있다 없다의 문제가 아니라 그 이것들을 어떻게 운영을 하는가 그리고 이 운영을 하면서 어떻게 안 망하는가가 훨씬 더 중요한 것이 아닌가. 오히려 이것들은 거꾸로 처음 질문이랑 같이 연결이 되는데 결국은 영토 안에 있는 네트워크를 관리하는 힘, 즉 영토성이 네트워크를 보장하지 않는가라는 이제 질문을 던지고 싶었습니다. 그래서 그 첫 번째 질문이랑 같이 연결되어 있는 것이기도 한데 첫 번째 질문을 답하시면서 대부분 이 질문을 또 답을 하셨어요. 이 질문에 대해서. 근데 이제 그래도 뭐 한번 이 부분에 대해서 망한 그 옛날의 제국들, 인프라스트럭처의 최고봉을 달렸던 제국들이 망하는 것들 이런 것들에 대해서 이제 어떻게 생각을 하시는지 그리고 네트워크는 결국은 그러니까 인프라스트럭처는 플로우를 보장해주는 길이긴 하지만 이 플로우를 유지하는 건 또 별개의 문제가 아닌가라는 이제 질문입니다. 이건 아까 신장 위구르 얘기하셨으니까 같이 연결이 되는 건데 열심히 중국이 신장 위구르 쪽에 파이프라인을 깔았어요. 깔았는데 갑자기 분리를 하겠다라고 해버리면 뭐 파키스탄이나 아니면 같이 연결을 해가지고 하겠다고 하면 오히려 중국 입장에서는 헤게모니가 약화되는 거거든요. 자기가 깔은 인프라스트럭처가 그쪽에 그 분리주의를 갖다가 더 그 힘있게 만드는 그런 작업들을 하게 되는 겁니다. 그러니까 이런 질문들, 즉 공급망을 갖다가 까는 것뿐만이 아니라 그것들을 유지하는 것에 대한 힘, 이에 대해서 이제 여쭤보고 싶습니다.
Empires and states and powers rise and fall for many different factors and reasons. Sometimes it's corruption, domestic corruption in the capital. Sometimes it's civil war. Sometimes they spend too much on war and conflict and less on national development. Sometimes they lose their place in the global value chain and they lose revenues and they weaken and become poor. There are many reasons, therefore, why a state or a power will get weaker or stronger over time. If we look at the world today, I worry about countries whose role, whose dominance of certain industries is weakening. Let's look at the Arab countries and the oil-producing countries. They became very wealthy from the 1970s until the 2000s. 40 years of immense wealth creation because oil prices were high. But now oil is cheap and getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And America is the largest producer of oil and gas in the world, not Saudi Arabia. So these countries are struggling desperately, and their reserves are falling. They're having to cut subsidies, cut spending. They may get poorer. And they're certainly, their centrality in the global division of labor is weakening. And that is what the supply chain tug of war is about, is maintaining your supply chain position because that is what maintains your wealth. That allows you to sustain the strength of your state. So every country has to always guard its positioning while trying to innovate and create new positions for the future. So rise and fall is a constant threat. Infrastructure matters a lot in this the quality of your infrastructure correlates sometimes to the quality of your government. I have been saying this informally for more than 10 years. When I'm driving in the roads of Central Asia that are so bad, I say to myself, this is also a bad government. In America today, the infrastructure is terrible. And a lot of people say, you know, this is a reflection of the declining quality of governance. The willingness to invest in high quality infrastructure is a sign of the commitment of the government to the society and to the territorial national integrity. And that's part of what China is doing today, is saying we have these borders of China, but so much of China is underdeveloped, poor, disconnected. So we will build highways, railways to the most remote parts of Tibet, Xinjiang. We will modernize and build cities everywhere. Those are also strategic assets. It's not just about national development. Those are strategic national assets. There are strategic international corridors for China to expand influence, as we were discussing earlier. So if there is any disruption, it is treated as a very serious national security threat. But we see this everywhere in the world. Wherever there is a pipeline that is cut off, it becomes a major geopolitical issue. Look at Russia and Ukraine. Russia's gas supplies to Europe flow through Ukraine. And Ukraine has, in the past, been known to cut off or to siphon gas away. And that is part of the reason why Russia invaded Ukraine, is to assert its control over the energy infrastructure. Not because it wants to conquer Ukraine, because Ukraine itself is not very valuable. What is valuable is the geography as a passageway for pipelines. So again, infrastructure and supply chains can be more valuable than territory itself. But we have to cross that territory with that infrastructure to assert our control over it. And that is, again, one of the central messages of connectography. The situation in the Arab Gulf countries right now is a very good example of the tension between connectivity and culture and geography. Because the Sunni countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council have now split. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, they have cut their relationship with Qatar. Why? Actually, Qatar has very close relations with Iran. And Oman also has close relations with Iran. So these countries that cut their relations with Qatar, they asked Oman to also do it, but Oman said no. Because Oman and Qatar have good relations with Iran. So you see that even though they are Arab, even though they are Sunni countries, they do not all agree, right? They have the same culture, same language, same religion, right? Even belong to the same organization. But they cannot agree because two of the countries, especially Qatar, are very connected to Iran. So it's a very good example of connectivity having such a power over the decision making. And those countries that are not connected to Iran want to fight with Iran. Those countries that are connected to Iran don't want to fight with Iran. Now, North and South Korea, this is a very interesting dynamic. There are, of course, very regular missile tests and saber rattling, as we call it, tensions or displays of strength. I went to the North about 5 years ago, and I write about it in one chapter of this book, where I discuss my experience there. And my sense that if you look incrementally over time, you see more penetration of mobile phones, of consumer technology, of awareness of the world. You see that the government is trying to encourage all areas to develop commercial zones, especially economic zones, to develop a certain business because, of course, there is very little wealth in the country. You can see the talk about doing more infrastructure projects with China and with Russia, potentially even a railway and a port. So all of these are small incremental examples of more connectivity to the North and more connectivity through the North. Over time, I believe that shifts the incentives of the government in Pyongyang. They will eventually realize that connectivity will make them, will save them from their poverty, that it will help them to modernize, that it will allow them to integrate into the world, that it will diminish their hostility with everyone. And so that power of connectivity psychologically is what I think will happen if we focus less on the missile tests and more on the opportunities. Because ultimately engagement shapes change. And that is the same for many, many countries in the past. And I think that hopefully it will also be true of the situation with North Korea.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was very fun. Very good questions. Very good questions.